Former Bay Street economist Jeff Rubin turned himself into a fledgling author a few years ago when he wrote his first book, Why Your World is Going to Get a Whole Lot Smaller. It was a blockbuster of sorts, which encouraged him to write another called End of Growth. This new bestseller makes some more hard-hitting points about our future, our economic fate, and how it is tied to fossil fuels. For over 20 years, Rubin was the chief economist at CIBC World Markets. He was one of the first to accurately predict soaring oil prices. And it is my pleasure to welcome Jeff Rubin to Studio 4 to tell us more. So when you told the head banker, I think I'll write a little book, what was his response?
He seemed less than thrilled. It was coming home late at night from a CEO dinner we had done in Old Montreal and flying back to Toronto. And he gave me a nicey stare and said, well, Jeff, we're going to have to run that by the legal department. Mm-hmm. And I guess 4 months later, I heard that, they didn't want me to publish the book, which was their right, because when you're the chief economist of a major financial institution, whether it's CIBC or Merrill Lynch or Royal Bank of Canada, whatever, you're a de facto a spokesman for that institution, whether you want to be or not. And triple-digit oil prices reversing globalization just wasn't something that CIBC wanted to be associated.
And
I guess that's their right.
Yes, and you didn't call the central bankers by any chance, did you? No. So Bernanke and Carney didn't come in on this decision. When did you decide you would rather write than work at the bank?
Well, if I had decided to stay at the bank and not publish my book, I would have regretted that decision for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. So it really wasn't a choice at that point. I didn't realize when I was writing it that I would necessarily be leaving the bank. But once I wrote it, I didn't write it so that nobody would read it.
That's why you're an economist. Mm-hmm. So that was why your world.
But Fanny, I'm not a victim here. Like I'm doing what I want to do. I'm doing what I wanted to do. What writer doesn't want to write, right? And I've been chief economist of an investment bank for 20 years. It's probably time to move on.
Of course, and you know how banks work, how they really work, and what goes on, and how debt agencies work, and who knows what, and who tells what, and what to believe and what not to believe, and all of that.
Right, and being the chief economist of an investment bank was an odd pulpit to deliver the message that my first book or this book delivered, and so, yeah.
Yes, and the title, The End of Growth, and then in tiny print it says, but is that all bad? And you say...
Well, I think we're going to find some silver linings because, of course, growth is the holy grail of our society, whether it's the, manager of an electronics store, the developer of a new subdivision, the finance minister trying to find revenues to close the deficit. They're all praying at the altar of growth. So when you say, hey, maybe we can't grow as much, that instinctively sounds apocalyptic. And it can be apocalyptic, but I think it's only apocalyptic if we insist on living in a certain way. And I think my book suggests that maybe we'll adapt, and that in the process we'll find more than a few silver linings.
And it may not be our choice.
It may not be our choice, but for example, on the issue of carbon emissions, taking that out of our hands might be a good thing because we're never going to be able to afford to burn half the fuel that, like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns we will in the next 20 years, because when we don't grow, guess what? We stop combusting coal and oil, and we stop doing that, we stop emitting.
So it could be a friend to the environment in a sense. So the proof that our economic fate is tied to fossil fuels.
And in particular to triple-digit oil prices.
Yes.
I think, every major recession that we've had in the last 40 years has had oil's fingerprints all over it. What's different in the past was somebody turned off the spigot, somebody invaded an oil-producing country. The spigot is wide open. The problem is we can no longer afford what's flowing through it. Peak oil isn't about what you can drill. We'll never run out of oil. There's like 170 billion barrels of it in the Alberta tar sands alone, more in the Orinoco tar sands. But what peak oil is really about is what we can afford to burn. Because if we can't afford to burn it, it doesn't matter if we can pump it out or not.
Right.
And that's the problem. Like, to get at tomorrow's fuel supply, it's going to places like the tar sands or, under the Arctic or deep water. And the problem with it is it doesn't flow at prices that we can afford.
So the extraction is just too expensive simply, and the damage to the environment not so good either. And what it would take to not damage the environment, and we saw what happened in the Gulf with the BP spill.
That's right. And the minute oil prices come crashing down, as they do in a recession, what happens? All of these new wonderful sources of supply suddenly become uneconomic. Like, for example, they cut $50 billion of capital spending in Fort McMurray when oil prices fell to $40 a barrel in the last recession. And they just didn't do that in Fort McMurray. They did it in the Brazilian subsalt. They did it in deep water. They did it in Arctic, because none of this stuff makes sense at $40, $50 a barrel.
Well, a decade ago or so, what was oil? $20 a barrel? Something like that?
That's right. And now it's over 100. It's been over 100 for most of this year. That's where Brent, the world oil prices, has traded. And my point is that when oil prices change that dramatically, you just don't change how fast you drive your car. You change the speed at which economies can grow.
And in this global world, we have China and India, and they are increasing consumption. And at the end of the century, we'll have 10 billion people living on the earth trying to stay warm, drive cars, consume.
Well, I think we're going to end up consuming less. And I think in the world going forward, when we adapt to this world of slower growth, we're going to find that less is more. That learning to live with less, particularly when it comes to energy consumption, is really the sustainable way to go, as opposed to always wanting to consume more.
And where does coal fit into the picture? Lots of coal in the world,
lots
too.
Of coal,
not lots of good coal, but lots of coal.
The same story as oil.
Lots of brown coal.
But if you look at thermal coal prices in Asia, where coal demand is coming from, China burnt 3.2 trillion tons of the stuff last year. Coal's over $100 a ton. And just to put that in perspective, that's about as expensive as oil being $100 a barrel. And again, the world's never going to run out of coal. It's never going to run out of oil, but it's running out of the fuel that its economies can afford to burn.
And yet, you know how we humans are. We saw what happened, the subprime meltdown, the banks' reaction, the bailouts, all of that. And I would ask you, as an economist, what has really changed? What lesson did we learn from all that
nothing has changed.
bailouting?
And isn't that bizarre? Because taxpayers were told all around the world that if they didn't fork out trillions to failing banks that were too big to fail, that we would have a financial catastrophe worse than the Great Depression. You might have thought that after doing that, taxpayers would have insisted on regulatory reform so this would never happen again. No sooner, 2-3 years later, we hear J.P. Morgan writing off $2 billion. Last year, Union Bank of Switzerland writing off $2 billion. I mean, if Greece defaults, we're going to find that our financial markets are no more capable of handling that than the subprime mortgage default in the United States. And the lesson that I learned at the bank that I used to work at is you didn't have to be a big player in the subprime mortgage market to be hit by that. We're going to find out that everybody owns a little piece of Greece or Spain, whether you've invested a cent in the Greek or Spanish bond market.
That's what amazes us, because I know I don't have any stock in Greece, but I know it will affect me. I don't know how exactly, but it all seems to be linked up.
Because in this deregulated world of financial markets, and deregulation has been occurring for the last 30 years since Reagan and Thatcher, our financial institutions are as interconnected as our Facebook pages.
Okay,
so that when a Greek bank fails, it doesn't take long before a French bank and a German bank is in trouble, and it doesn't take long before all of a sudden you feel that on the Atlantic, just like people all around the world felt the collapse of subprime mortgages, and they went, hey, we didn't have a subprime mortgage lending operation.
Right, and we lost Bear Stearns, but many Canadians, we get a little high on our banks, say, but our banks, don't worry about our banks. They're fine.
Well,
they're solid.
Okay, I mean, it's true that our banks did not cost taxpayers money, but if you were a shareholder in any of the Canadian banks, particularly the one that I used to work for when the subprime mortgage hit, then you felt that, and I'm saying that everybody's felt it. Banks in Iceland, banks in Ireland failed and left taxpayers with billions of dollars to pick up. That means hospitals and schools are closed or don't get built because all of a sudden some bank had this huge exposure to some market thousands of miles away and hadn't properly insured the risk.
And what does that have to do with CDOs?
So, well,
Collateralized debt obligations. I was reading about them in
exactly. The bank that I used to work for had to write off billions of dollars because these CDOs, these fancy derivative instruments that were given a AAA wrapping paper by the rating agencies, inside of that was a whole bunch of subprime mortgages. So when people stopped paying those subprime mortgages, those CDOs exploded, and all of a sudden banks around the world who thought they weren't exposed to the US subprime mortgage started writing off billions.
So, at a simple level, who compensates the debt rating agencies, for instance? Like they say, okay, this is happening and we believe it, but who's paying them to tell the story?
Oddly enough, the people that they're rating. Oddly enough. And so if you're wondering why all of a sudden were these subprime mortgages given a AAA rating, the highest rating that you could have, even the US Treasury doesn't have their AAA anymore. It's because of where were the rating agencies getting their business? The rating agencies were getting their business from the issuers of those subprime mortgages.
Okay, and we live in a modern society where growth is the holy grail.
And that's right. And I'm saying that, you know, we're going to find we can't grow as fast. So instead of going to extraordinary lengths like zero interest rates and running up huge trillion-dollar deficits in the U.S., what we got to realize is we got to gear down and we got to adapt to that.
Are there countries, and I'll ask you this after the break, countries that understand this, that are ahead of the pack, if you will? You mentioned Denmark in the book, a little greener perhaps.
Japan.
Countries we can emulate, and then we'll talk about India, China, and their impact on us. Who will be on top in 10 years? Jeff Rubin, our guest, The End of Growth, his new book.